You're in the rant hole where I rant about whatever my $15 a month plus patrons want me to rant about. You can get a rant by becoming one of those people. Lord Liquid Bacon II says to rant about Yu-Gi-Oh! Specifically the card game, but if you can, then the whole IP. Oh, you know I can. I love Yu-Gi-Oh! I got into Yu-Gi-Oh! When I was like 12 because I didn't have cable for a while, and all I had was WB, and I caught on to the show. And then I found out there was a card game, and the card game was fascinating because it was a bit more detailed and advanced than the Pokemon card game. There was just more going on with it. This was in, like, you know, the first set of cards back then. The cards improved a lot over the course of the first few generations, because early on the game wasn't that well balanced, or it just had a lot of things that made it not that fun to play. But as it got better balanced, I ended up building a deck that is what I consider to be a haymaker deck. I don't really know where this term comes from. I heard it from a guy who I played Pokemon with back in the day, but what he had described a haymaker deck as is when you try to have a lot of really strong first evolutions. You know, Pokemon that don't have to wait around to evolve, they're just strong out the gate, and, you know, usually those have lower overall HP and you know, won't necessarily be able to compete with those third stage Pokemon, but the key is to keep your opponent's board clear so they can't get out any of those things. And so that's basically what I built my deck around in Yu-Gi-Oh! Was having lots of 4-star monsters with like 1800 or 1700 or even 1900 attack points, regardless of defense. I just put in everything that's a strong attacker with a low summon rate, you know? And so, and then anything else was like built around getting out Blue Eyes as fast as possible, because I had 3 Blue Eyes in the deck and an Ultimate Dragon. So I would have, you know, Kaiser Seahorse out there who's got like 1700 attack and can be sacrificed individually for a Blue Eyes as opposed to having to use 2 sacrifices. So yeah, it was all about just like getting as much power on the field as quickly as possible. No real tactics beyond that. And I also had tons of like healing cards. So like most of my Magic cards were either stuff that increases your attack power, so shit like Rush Recklessly or Malevolent Nuzzler, or I can't believe I'm pulling these out of the fucking back of my mind. Acts of Despair. How do I even remember all this shit? And then you know, like trap cards that are mostly about getting rid of monsters. So basically my whole theory was just to overpower the opponent as fast as possible. Now, that works against my little brother in 2004. That works against the little kids who go to Yu-Gi-Oh! League in 2006 or 7, you know? But the Yu-Gi-Oh! Card game eventually became all structure decks. All structure decks. All cards with a fucking gigantic paragraph of description of what they do. And, like, those cards always existed, but it wasn't so much like the whole game. Like, I remember back when Relinquished was like, it was incredibly complex how to use this thing, and like, or like the Toon World decks and stuff, and most of the time it was just more of a pain in the ass than it was worth. I do think I used Relinquished extensively, but like, you know, it just like wasn't, there wasn't like a whole deck of all paragraph long descriptions until a certain point, somewhere, you know, beyond Yu-Gi-Oh! GX and all that shit, where, like, it just became that every deck was, like, you had to know what every fucking card in the deck does and how they all relate to one another for your deck to even be usable. But those kinds of decks are set up in such a way that if you don't have countermeasures in place, if you don't have defensive strategies within your deck, you'll just get fucked immediately. And if you ever saw the bonus episode of Insufferable Social Media Argument, the podcast, where I played against Mumkey Jones, and he just swept me for like 2 or 3 matches in a row, because we both had imported our real-life decks into this like website that lets you, you know, plug and play your cards and fight each other. And like, I'm still using the deck that I built in 2004 or 5. Like, that's the last time it was updated. So like, yeah, my cards were extra strong back then because they're like a 4-star monster with 1800 attack. There were only like 3 of those, and they were really powerful to have. Now we're at a point where power levels don't even fucking matter. Like, attack and defense is barely relevant at this point because you've got cards that are doing things that are just like constantly deck manipulation, constantly drawing extra cards, or fucking, you know, shuffling, or bringing out certain monsters, special summons, and like it's so over the top, and I don't find it fun because you have to read so much shit to even baseline understand your deck, and then you start using it, and it's like the game just boils down, it just comes to a screeching halt, because unless both players know what every single card in the fucking entire game does, then like you're gonna have to constantly explain what your cards do to one another, and some of those effects are just like so long that like it's just it becomes a discussion about what your cards do, you know, more so than just playing a game together. And you have to, you know, basically like solve the riddle of your deck and then use it and then explain the riddle of your deck to your opponent, and the turns take a fucking eternity. So yeah, I don't find the modern Yu-Gi-Oh game all that fun. I prefer to play with the older cards from like the glory era of like the game being well balanced but not quite yet absurd. And I think it just kind of reached that point because, I mean, how much can you do with the game without going to that extent? You know, I mean, I think Magic is probably a game that is more about continuing to build on the strategies that exist, and it's not so much about having like a completely constructed deck as being able to construct a deck through, you know, generations of different cards. So I'm sure even in that game, probably the old cards are worthless by this point. But you know, that's what frustrates me about card games, is that you basically always have to be up to date because the new cards will change the meta of the game so much that old cards just become completely worthless. Like if you try to play Pokemon without a deck full of EX cards, it's like, what's the fucking point? Your deck's gonna suck, you know? As for the rest of the Yu-Gi-Oh franchise, you know, I can still watch the anime. I can still watch the dub just because it's so hilarious, and I fucking love all the stupid voices. And, you know, of course there's Yu-Gi-Oh! Abridged, which I watched pretty much since it started up. So, like, yeah, I'm well familiar. I don't watch the later seasons, anything after the first, because they're all fucking terrible. But I do still go back and fucks with some OG Yu-Gi-Oh! From time to time. So yeah, there you go.